Welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us at the Divinity School this evening, and welcome to those who are watching on the webcast that is also starting 4 or 5 minutes late, I guess. 100 years ago, in the fall of 1911, the newly formed Andover-Harvard Theological Library opened its doors to faculty, students, staff, alumni, and even local clergy. In his annual report that year, Dean William Wallace Finn reported this newsworthy event in a short single sentence. More deans should be brief, I guess. And I quote, "In accordance with our agreement with Andover Theological Seminary, the libraries of the two institutions have been consolidated into the Andover-Harvard Theological Library," end quotation. It seems quite appropriate that we are gathered here in what was the original reading room. It was not sloped at that time, if you've seen photographs of that. What was originally the reading room of the Andover-Harvard Theological Library when it opened 100 years ago this autumn. It's also fitting because this room, the Sperry Room, is illuminated with unusual and beautiful windows depicting printer's marks. If you look up, and you can still see with enough light outside behind the blinds, printer's marks, which were the trademarks, of course, of the earliest book printers from the 15th to the 17th centuries in Germany, England, Italy, and other parts of Europe. Printer's marks have been used to decorate libraries, and of course they invoke as symbols for books and learning the importance of words and texts to culture and society as well. We open this Centennial Year celebration with this evening's lecture, Words Over Bullets. It's appropriate from many angles, but not least its emphasis also on words and its lineage as a phrase drawn from the writings of a major literary figure of the past 100 years, Albert Camus, something we shall, I'm sure, shortly hear more about from our speaker. To bring us to his words, let me now introduce our speaker himself. And I will come to that, but I just realized that I did want to mention one other thing. I think we have at least 2 former librarians with us. I know that we have our most recent librarian, Laura Wood, now librarian at Tufts, who from 2004 until this summer was our librarian here. Laura, if you would just make yourself known there. And I understand that Peter Oliver, who was librarian from 74 to... Mr. Oliver, it's a pleasure to have you. Would you please stand and let yourself be known? 74 to 78, I believe. Is that right? Roughly, yes. It's great to have you back, and I'm sorry I wanted to mention both of you. It's a pleasure. And actually, Malcolm Hamilton, who was librarian from 1999 into the early part of my deanship here in 2003, was planning to come tonight but is ill and not able to make it, so I'm very sorry that he couldn't be with us. Now, I come to our speaker, and for me, it's both a professional and a personal pleasure to introduce to you Gustav Niebuhr. He is Associate Professor of Newspaper and Online Journalism in the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University, with an appointment also in the Department of Religion in the College of Arts and Sciences. In addition, he directs the undergraduate program in Religion and Society and is founding director of the Carnegie Religion and Media Program, a project funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, as you might suspect. I've followed Gustav's career since he finished college at Pomona, studied at Oxford, and then moved into elite-level journalism very quickly, with first the Wall Street Journal and then the Washington Post, covering religion in America. Thereafter, he became still better known as a major journalistic commentator on religion while serving as national correspondent, reporting on religion, of course, for the New York Times from 1994 to 2001. I, like many others here tonight, have long appreciated his keenly perceptive, thoughtful, and never superficial journalistic commentaries on religion, and especially, of course, religion in America. On a more personal level, I have watched Gustav Niebuhr's productive life unfold for some 4 decades now, back into his youth. And at a distance, of course, most of the time, but also at moments closer up. I knew him first when he was quite young, before he moved off to college across the continent, as one of the 2 children of our longtime friends, Richard and Nancy Niebuhr. Richard Niebuhr was my first senior colleague for the early years of my original teaching appointment in Harvard College in the 1970s, when together, assisted from our 3rd year there, 1976, by Diana Eck, we were creating an undergraduate concentration together in comparative religion for Harvard undergraduates. As for personal contact closer up with Gustav, even before he finished college, as I remember it, I, as a middle-aged mountaineer, got to share rock climbs with him on a couple of occasions in the White Mountains. One route we did together on Cannon Mountain has now been wiped out completely by the collapse 8 years ago of the famous Old Man of the Mountain. But Gustav will remember, I expect, the final 60-foot vertical chimney on the backside of the old man's famous profile. Believe me, you can tell a lot about a person when you rely on him to protect you on the steep side of a mountain. And Gustav is still someone I would entrust myself to on the sharp end of any climbing rope. Prior to coming to Syracuse in 2004, Gustav spent 2 years following his 7 years at the New York Times as a visiting fellow and scholar in residence at Princeton University's Center for the Study of Religion, an institute known very well to many of our faculty here. In 2008, Viking Press published his book, Beyond Tolerance, Searching for Interfaith Understanding in America. As anyone who has read this inspiring work knows, it focuses not on religious fanaticism, intolerance, or conflict, but on the possibilities of real conversation and interchange across religious communal boundaries, especially in post-9/11 America. To read it is to be moved by his vivid retelling of stories of Americans who have truly moved beyond mere toleration in their actions and their lives. It is also to become hopeful about future possibilities in spite of so much religious dogmatism and extremism evident all around us in every religious community we have. His book received the Frederick G. Melker Book Award of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and in September a year ago, Gustav received the William A. Reed Lifetime Achievement Award of the Religion News Writers Association. He continues, of course, to write on religion, including for online sites such as the Huffington Post. He lives in Syracuse with his wife, Margaret I. Ustansky, who is a sociologist and also a Syracuse faculty member. They have 2 sons. And it is a great pleasure to welcome him, and certainly an honor to introduce to you Gustav Niebuhr.
Thank you so much, Dean Graham, Bill. That's a very generous introduction. I must say, I've never forgotten that climb up Cannon Mountain. And I also am delighted to say that I've passed on an interest in rock climbing to my sons, who are 13 and 9 respectively. We went out to an indoor rock climbing site called Rock Ventures in Rochester not long ago, where I belayed them as they climbed up all kinds of vertical surfaces that I could not do, but I was glad to see someone could. Well, good evening, and I should also add good evening, friends, as I see so many people here and have shaken hands with people here whom I've known for a long time. It feels a bit like a homecoming, which is awfully nice, and I'm also deeply delighted to have been asked to participate in these centennial celebrations of the Andover-Harvard Theological Library. That's not only because I value being among you at the singular time, but also because of the essential nature of the event. The flyer for this speech wonderfully pictured me as being among books, and such a position is one that for me I take both comfort and also excitement in. As you know, I grew up in the library's shadow, and as a child I would accompany my father on trips through its stacks, and later on when he had his office on the 3rd floor of the library, I would approach it through the stacks. And it's sort of a very memorable way to go to one's father's office, because it in and of itself imparts a sort of a value. One's cocooned in one way or another in words, but I should say something more actively than that. The title of my presentation tonight, Choosing Words Over Bullets, is meant not simply to honor the occasion that brings us together, but to speak to a fundamental challenge of our time. And it also paraphrases the concluding statement of a book, a very short book, given to me under circumstances that rendered it memorable. The essence of that statement came back to me many years after I first read that book, as I was working to find a way to frame the basic lesson of the research I was doing, research that became my book, Beyond Tolerance. By way of getting to that particular story, how I came to that phrase, let me loop back again to my family, in this case to my mother, Nancy Niebuhr. After childhood and college, when I would return to visit my parents, she'd often ask me, "What are you reading?" Now, that question was never meant casually. She always asked it early in my visit with a smile and a clear sense of expectation. She really wanted to know. Her question, which, by the way, she still sometimes asks, was an inquiry into where I got some of my pleasure in life and to which ideas I was exposing myself. What are you reading? Of course, she was reading as well, and sometimes we traded books. I think the two experiences of being in libraries, in this library with my father, and of being with a mother who never lacked for a book, prepared me for the experience of taking the written word very seriously. And as a journalist, my profession from 1980 until 2001, and in my blood still, I found it fundamental that I listened very carefully to what people had to say, the spoken word, that is. Often enough, the two, the written and the spoken, intersected, reinforced each other in a way that I'll refer to this evening. One such case, and this will get me back to my title, occurred a quarter century ago in Atlanta. There I worked as a journalist whose beat involved writing about religion in the Southeast, a very rich experience, as you can imagine. That work meant a great deal more than simply talking to clergy in their houses of worship, but occasionally it did involve that. And one summer afternoon, I met a man at his church where he greeted me by immediately sliding a pamphlet into my hand. "Read this," he said, and referring to himself and his congregation, "if you want to know who we are." Now, I had lived in the South long enough by then to find nothing unusual in being handed a tract, ostensibly addressed to me, the reader, by someone serious about her or his faith. That happened all the time, and seemed to me that it may have been one of the reasons that there are street corners in the South. They provide the opportunity for individuals standing there to pass you religious literature. But the experience to which I refer proved unique, as the challenge posed in that pamphlet had nothing overt to say about the destination of the reader's soul, but rather the responsibilities that she would or would not assume here on earth. To clarify, the minister belonged to the Unitarian Universalist Association, a familiar group here at Harvard, and the pamphlet he gave me, titled "Neither Victims Nor Executioners," contained essays written by Albert Camus in the year after the Second World War. Camus described the basic moral choices involved in living in a world nearly broken by Nazism and faced with possible confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. This, in part, is what he said and what I read. Quote, "In the coming years, an endless struggle will be waged across 5 continents, a struggle in which either violence or dialogue will prevail. Granted, the former has nearly 1,000 times the chances of the latter. But I've always thought that if the person who places hope in the human condition is a fool, then he who gives up hope in the face of circumstances is a coward. Henceforth, the only honor will lie in obstinately holding to a formidable gamble that words are stronger than bullets." I found a real clarity in Camus' proposition, enough so to make his words deeply memorable. Well, I didn't think about that every day, of course, but it sank into some deep area of my memory where it rested for years until I found I really needed to recall it. And that would have been a few years back as I worked on a book about interreligious dialogue and cooperation in the U.S. Now, that particular subject, the hard work of constructing positive interfaith relations, had interested me increasingly during my last years at the New York Times. As I traveled the country, reporting other stories, all connected in one way or another with the broad idea of religion, I became convinced that a scattered grassroots movement was taking hold in cities and suburbs that focused on bringing people of very different theological belief sets into productive contact with one another. In part, this movement, and there seemed no other word for it, drew its inspiration from a recognition of an emerging religious diversity that in its complexity was unlike anything we Americans had experienced. To some people I encountered, that diversity in and of itself offered an educational opportunity with clear social benefits, a chance to get to know people of different faiths as they were, without trying to convert them, without accepting the stereotypes to which they as a group may fall prey. I began to recognize it as a very big story, but an elusive one for a journalist. Yes, as a movement, interfaith encounters often shared common principles, but the action involved occurred very gradually over time, and it featured a great deal of talk. Two conditions that would make it very difficult to persuade an editor, even at the New York Times, that it could be dealt with as a news story. That's not easy material. Not in the conventional sense, but then movements aiming at real social change rarely begin otherwise. As one of my editors who came of age professionally in the 1950s and 1960s liked to say, if we in the news organizations had just paid a little bit more attention to what was going on inside predominantly African American churches in the Southeast, we would have grasped the breadth and depth and durability of the civil rights movement long before we did. Now, I can't be here at Harvard Divinity School without paying respect to those who've recognized and written about the diversification of the American religious landscape. Diana Eck and the late Bill Hutchinson, who put it in its historic context. I had my first real brush with the interfaith movement in 1993 when I attended an extraordinary week-long event in Chicago marking the Centennial of the world's Parliament of Religions. Thousands of people had been invited and thousands had come. They held lectures, workshops, panel discussions. Mainly, I think, they just met each other. But that had its value. After all real living is meeting. I grappled with how to describe what I saw. And in retrospect, it seems, the only real analogy lay in literature, in Moby Dick, to be precise. And here I cite one of my father's favorite books. Early on in the narrative, Ishmael introduces the South Pacific Islander, Queequeg, to the Quaker owners of the whaling ship, the Pequod. They, the owners, recognize Queequeg as extraordinarily gifted with a harpoon. But they have deep reservations about hiring someone they correctly assume is a non-Christian. To which church does your friend belong? They twice ask Ishmael. Finally, Ishmael tells them that Queequeg fully belongs to, quote, First Congregationalist Church of the whole worshiping world, close quote. That church convened in Chicago in 1993, and it might have been a one-time event like its historic predecessor a century earlier. But the original Parliament did not fold its tent without a longer-term effect. it elevated to national status a singular figure, a bilingual Bengali teacher, Swami Vivekananda, whose speeches, his attire, he wore a turban, and self-confident bearing made him an object of deep fascination in Victorian America. And as to those speeches, he left behind a blunt, direct message of interreligious cooperation across theological divides with respect for differences. And he began to be read and quoted again in the 1990s. Those who organized the 1993 event had the remarkable good fortune of closing shop with a surplus, if you can imagine such a thing, a nonprofit being able to do that. So they decided to continue the practice of holding regular meetings like that one at 5 or 6 year intervals. But more important than that, the idea of peaceful, educational encounter was affirmed through the experiences of those who traveled to Chicago. They took its message to their homes and put the idea into practice, seeking connections with people of other faiths in various cities across the United States and elsewhere. And then came September 11th, 2001, whose 10th anniversary we've just passed. That week, a friend of mine at the Times, a man named Lou, who could be described as being of secular outlook in the conventional sense of that term, asked me if I thought Americans were now likely to be less religious, to become less religious because they had been so abruptly and brutally exposed to religion's darkest side. Well, I certainly didn't dismiss his question. All questions about religion seem fair, particularly so then. But I did say I doubted the event would have that effect, if only because the overwhelming majority of people who called themselves religious in one way or another did not identify either themselves or their religion with acts of atrocious violence. What we'd witnessed that day was an exceedingly cruel demonstration of what my great-uncle Reinhold Niebuhr called absolutism, the self-justifying quest for the impossible ideal. Absolutism, he wrote in his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, in both religious and political idealism is a splendid incentive to heroic action, but a dangerous guide in immediate and concrete situations. The absolutists fail to understand that they'll inevitably confront their nemesis, which he described as the inertia of human nature. Furthermore, he wrote, they, quote, risk the welfare of millions when they gamble for the attainment of the absolute. And since coercion is an invariable instrument of their policy, absolutism transmutes this instrument into unbearable tyrannies and cruelties. The fanaticism, which in the individual may appear in the guise of a harmless or pathetic vagary, when expressed in political policy, shuts the gates of mercy on mankind, close quote. And that phrase has been with me ever since I first read it. And yet I think my friend Lou's question deserved more of a response than I was able to offer at the time. And perhaps I've been responding to it ever since, as I do now. On September 11th, I caught my usual commuter train into Manhattan from Princeton, where I then lived. I happened to sit on the east-facing side of the New Jersey Transit train car when I saw, shortly after we rounded Newark International Airport, a bluish-gray cloud inexplicably rising over the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Our train rumbled into Newark Station and then emerged after a disconcertingly long stop of at least 5 minutes. As we raced across the meadowlands, we saw both towers, their upper floors shrouded in dense, malevolent smoke. No one can be prepared for violence on that scale. The people around me went utterly silent, except for one person who wept. In retrospect, those two responses seem natural and fitting. Acts of terror can be carried out without words, and as terror, they are meant to deprive people of speech. The purpose is to crush our humanity, take away our ability to communicate rationally, and replace it with stark, uncontrollable fear. What I didn't know that morning, however, is that not everyone had lost her or his speech. Very shortly after the towers in New York collapsed, someone in Seattle did an extraordinary thing, taking out a note card and writing a simple statement that said, quote, "We don't blame all Muslims," close quote. Whoever wrote that then took it in hand and left it leaning against the front door of the Islamic School of Seattle. I know this because the school's principal, Ann El Moslemeni, told me about it 5 months later. She became deeply worried after the attacks that the 70 or so children under her charge, kindergartners through 8th graders, might be at risk in a possible backlash by individuals driven wild with fear and grief. But when she canceled classes for that week and opened the doors to parents arriving to pick up their children, she found notes like that one that I quoted, and bunches of flowers, too. And when she and the children returned a week later to the school, they were greeted by adolescents from an alternative high school across the street who carried signs saying, "Welcome back." And when she went into her office, she got a call from the Seattle Council of Churches offering volunteers to come down, patrol the sidewalks, and keep an eye on the building. The council, on September 11th and the days immediately following, had been flooded with calls from individuals, many of whom had never called that organization before, but who wanted to do something to prevent innocent people among them from being harassed or attacked. And so the council signed them up under a program it called Watchful Eyes to walk the sidewalks in shifts 24/7 at the school, a local mosque, and a Sikh gurdwara. That went on for weeks and weeks, months into the winter, and a lot of conversations got going among people who had never met each other before and who were of different faiths. The thing is, that response was not unique. Not by a long shot. Volunteers organized a protective human ring around a mosque in Denver. In Herndon, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, on September 12th, the day after vandals had broken into a mosque and defaced its walls, the imam, the prayer leader, got a call from his neighbors asking if they could come over and help him clean up. One man, who identified himself as Jewish, said he wanted to pay for the paint. You can imagine this made an impression on Imam Muhammad Magid. At that time, his mosque had just broken ground for a new building on a site nearby. A large sign identified the project. The neighbors began turning out in the evening in vigils to protect the sign itself. In Syracuse, on the morning of 9/11, Betsy Morgan, a United Methodist, took down her phone book and looked up the number of the Islamic Society of Central New York. She called and asked the man who picked up the phone there, "Is there anything I can do to help the women in your mosque?" And he put her in touch with Danya Wellman, who worshiped at the mosque, and the two sat down at Morgan's kitchen table to talk. And from that single get-to-know-you conversation emerged an organization. The two invited their friends to come join them. A monthly meeting began. Participants brought food for potluck dinners. The circle expanded to include Roman Catholics, Jews, Buddhists, agnostics. They talked about their families, about their beliefs, about the world. They gave their group a name, Women Transcending Boundaries, and launched a website. They raised thousands of dollars to build a girls' school in Pakistan. I largely missed these activities when they began. They fell beneath the media radar. People acted locally. They put out no press releases, nor did their activities wind up, of course, on the police blotter. Local news organizations and national ones tended to miss them. But together, these activities showed that people had not lost their voices and were determined to use them for good. To be sure, some people offered hints of what was happening. A rabbi, a friend of mine who'd been an administrator at Jewish Theological Seminary but had since taken a pulpit in Los Angeles, emailed me a copy of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem, Dirge Without Music, which opens, "I'm not resigned to the shutting away of loving hearts in the hard ground. So it is, and so it will be, for so it has been, time out of mind. Into the darkness they go, the wise and the lovely, crowned with lilies and laurel they go, but I'm not resigned." Eventually, I left the Times specifically to go write about this interfaith dialogue and cooperation, this grassroots movement, a large part of which was driven by a response to 9/11. Unsurprisingly, I found many different expressions of the trend, although, that said, it often depended on word of mouth to find them. I visited a mosque and a synagogue engaged in a 15-year dialogue on Long Island. A one-day gathering of different religious believers at a Thai Buddhist temple in northern Los Angeles. An annual celebration of religious differences with lectures, panels, artwork, dance, and music in Louisville, Kentucky, and more. All these activities, I believe, constituted a fitting response to terror. I also believe that the individual actions of the people who participated then and continue to do so now helped hold our nation together. Those actions constituted a vote on behalf of civil society. And I would write that some people choose to build networks that deliberately cross boundaries in an era in which religious differences are so explosive, and that constitutes a quiet counter-trend in that it directly challenges violence in God's name, even if it doesn't replace it. At its heart, it's a grassroots educational process in which the goal is to gain knowledge about individuals and their beliefs in a way that lessens fear. It's a new activity in the world, an entirely new phenomenon in our history. It's a social good, a basis for hope, and a tendency that ought to be nurtured and cultivated. What amazes me about this project, a citizens project, is that it's not at all easy, because it means confronting differences without acting to change them, but rather trying to understand them. The best statement that I heard on that came from a Roman Catholic theologian who put the challenge very succinctly when she asked, "Can one admit differences without being adversarial?" Now, that's a radical thing in the world, that you're not me and that I'm not you, but that doesn't mean a threat. Radical it is. The world's religions are remarkably varied. They're different systems of thought whose ultimate goals for the individual practitioner are highly distinct. Moreover, interreligious dialogue and cooperation also crucially means coming to grips with the fact that a single noun, Muslim, Christian, Jew, agnostic, Buddhist, Hindu, etc., does not tell one everything one needs to know about the person who holds that as a label. Let me say here, without, I hope, sounding prideful, that I've tried as a teacher to do my part, too, in this area. In recent years, as Dean Graham said, I've had the good fortune of having some backing from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to create a program in religion and media. As one aspect of that, I invite to campus individuals who are either the focus of news or practitioners of media, which I'd like my students and whoever else is interested to meet. I call these meetings public interviews because I begin them by asking my guests basic questions that allow her to speak both personally and expansively about issues at hand. Last year, I had as a guest Daisy Kahn, one of the principal figures in what was then being vilified as the mosque near Ground Zero. She impressed her audience at Syracuse. Not surprisingly, I thought, given that I had seen her speak before and had known her and her husband, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, for some years. Earlier this week, I invited Uzma Uddin, a lawyer, an advocate of religious freedom, and founder and editor of a web-based magazine called altmuslima.com. She's an exceptionally thoughtful speaker on the subject of Islam in the United States, on religious devotion, and on what it means to run a website that attracts not simply the Muslim women you thought you would get, but also Christians and Jews who find your subjects interesting and relevant for their own lives. Ms. Udine, who grew up in Miami, also spoke about her decision in college to wear a headscarf and her decision at the end of law school to take it off. More than anything else, I think that part of her talk affected the undergraduates who were present that day. I spoke with one of them afterwards, and he told me that he thought Ms. Udine was, in his words, a normal American. I gave that phrase some thought. I wouldn't dispute it. She struck me, too, as a normal American, one among perhaps 300 million. And that's an old story, unless you've never heard it, to borrow a phrase written by Michael Hare in Dispatches, his great book about the Vietnam War. Hare also made a moral statement in that book, one that has stayed with me ever since I first read it more than 30 years ago, and that is, you are as responsible for what you see as for what you do. In my own life, I had the great good fortune to have a profession that required me to travel the nation and sometimes go abroad to speak with people about what they held closest to themselves spiritually and how it caused them to act in society. Eventually, I discovered that such encounters left me in a peculiar position or situation, one I didn't expect. I felt hesitant to generalize easily about people. Not that I'd lost my opinions, not that I'd surrendered anything fundamental in myself. It's just that when I would hear people make broad brush statements, for good or for ill, about groups to which they did not belong, I would find myself often, not always, but often, in the uneasy position of wanting to say, well, yes, but, or sometimes just but. And this extended to people with whom I disagreed politically and culturally. For example, when the contentious subject of conservative Protestants, or even more so, fundamentalists, comes up among my friends, I've occasionally felt the need to step in, if only because I've known people in both groups, and some stand out clearly as individuals. Sure, some in their outward public behavior may fit a common stereotype, but perhaps that emphasis should be on some. I can't forget that when I worked in Atlanta, I knew a man who fit the theological description of fundamentalist, yet was absolutely committed to the same basic freedoms in which I believe and under which I long operated, freedom of speech and the press. He worked for the Southern Baptist Convention, and I saw him pay for his commitment with the loss of his job. Every person can be a text to be read if the opportunity presents itself. And the reading imparts an experience that adds a dimension to labels we might otherwise be tempted to dismiss. And then there's the writing that we ourselves do. What amazes me, what will always amaze me, is how the writing of those who seem to be the weakest, in sometimes the most vulnerable situations, endures to move us and inspire us years and years later. This, while the opposite is so often true of those who wield power so brutally. I once challenged an audience to consider whether they could come up with anything they remembered spoken or written by the late Osama bin Laden. I had recently read an entire book on al-Qaeda, a very good one too, by the way, Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower. But I still came up empty, as did my audience. And what that suggests is that terror goes only so far. Yes, it creates fear, and from fear can arise great destruction. But otherwise, it leaves little behind. Among others, W.H. Auden knew this. He wrote a poem titled August 1968, in response, I suppose, to the Soviet Union's army crushing an emerging democratic movement in Czechoslovakia. Here it is. The ogre does what ogres can, deeds quite impossible for man. But one prize is beyond his reach, the ogre cannot master speech. About a subjugated plain, amidst the desperate and slain, the ogre stalks with hands on hips, while drivel gushes from his lips. Now, the ogres of this world may hold a certain fascination for us, at a historical distance, of course, but they rarely are truly memorable, and they are not widely quoted. Many years ago, sitting in a reading room at the British Museum, I happened to glance up at the shelves above me to see a long series of leather-bound, gold-embossed books, the complete works of the dictator Enver Hoxha. They looked just as fresh and crisp and unopened as the day they had been shipped from Albania to London. But that's not true for Hoxha's opposites, is it? Those men and women who put their energies into building community, civil society, democracy. They are memorable. They are quoted. They inspire long after their deaths. A friend who's built an interfaith organization that operates among college students, Eboo Patel, is a Muslim who came to a religious and community-centered awakening through his reading of Dorothy Day, the great Catholic exponent of workers, pacifists, and the poor. Last year, I read a very good book about her, an ambitious four-way biography that dealt with Day, Thomas Merton, Flannery O'Connor, and Walker Percy as vital 20th century Catholic voices. It's called The Life You Save May Be Your Own. Some of her words, written in a letter to her newspaper, The Catholic Worker, stay with me. At age 59, she traveled down to Montgomery, Alabama, to see the civil rights bus boycott for herself. And days later, she went on to southern Georgia to visit Koinonia Farm, a sort of utopian agricultural community in which black and white families lived and worked together, in clearly visible violation of the prevailing cultural mandate, legal mandate too, of segregation. Day knew that many people outside the farm hated the place and wanted to see it eliminated. Yet she spent a night sitting watch against possible assailants in a car parked on the edge of the property. What did she do? She read. She read from her prayer book and was doing so when a carload of armed men pulled up and opened fire on her. They missed. She'd later write, "It is what I came for, to share in the fear and the suffering." Words over bullets. For inspiration, one could as easily quote others. After all, individuals these days find inspiration to pursue similar work as Eboo Patel in the writings of Gandhi or the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. or Pope John Paul II or Nelson Mandela or the 14th Dalai Lama. These are the people of our time whom we will remember best. Let me conclude by offering some thoughts in summary of our topic that came to me during the dedication of the 9/11 memorial in New York City nearly 4 weeks ago. I realized then that I hoped the names of the men and women inscribed on the memorial's walls would remind us and inspire us to continue the singularly positive reaction that followed 9/11. 10 years ago, amidst that national trauma, many Americans quietly but effectively reached out to one another across religious lines. Again, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, agnostics rallied to protect American Muslim property, mosques, schools, and homes, and individuals too. In doing so, they helped sustain civil society. Their actions expressed a profound faith in America as pluralistic and in the founding idea of the United States as a country of many groups, forged into a single nation. Conversations followed those actions. Community groups formed. Individuals got to know one another. They met in living rooms, sometimes in houses of worship, over coffee, asking questions, confronting stereotypes. I grew up in an era in which people warned against publicly discussing religion. It was off the table, along with money and politics. But that time is long past. Religion must be discussed if we are to be fully educated about our fellow citizens. We need to know what others really believe, how they interpret their texts, what they experience spiritually, and how their faith shapes their lives. We need to know so we can pierce the stereotypes and suspicions that would divide the overwhelmingly peaceful majorities among us. We need to know as a civic responsibility. We need to be able to recognize a demagogue for what he is when he attempts to wring poison from dogma. And we need to know, especially now, when our political system is so bereft of real leaders and the global economic network seems so frail. Mass terror takes many forms, some political, some ethnic, some based on economic theory, and some starkly racist. I've read my fill of news stories about the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Ku Klux Klan, Timothy McVeigh, and in July, Anders Breivik, the Norwegian alleged to have gunned down nearly 100 young people. Norwegian police, at least initially, called him a Christian terrorist, as jarring a conjunction of words as I have seen in a long time. Terror is democracy's enemy. Terror despises human rights. But fighting terror is not simply for the military. We forgot that for some time. Among us civilians, it demands a commitment to search for the common ethic among people you do not know. Does it mean risk-taking? Yes. And sometimes being disappointed, even disillusioned? Yes again. But here we might quote Emerson, and an appropriate place to do so. He has not learned the lesson of life who does not daily surmount a fear. In dealing with differences, especially religious differences, that's our charge, and there's nothing easy about it. It seems to me no accident that the 9/11 memorial should be dedicated at nearly the same time as a monument to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was unveiled on the Washington Mall. Writing from an Alabama jail, King described humanity as, quote, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, close quote. 4 years later, he preached a landmark sermon at Riverside Church in Manhattan, denouncing the Vietnam War. By then, he had met the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk committed to peace and to finding a third way in politics for his country. King would nominate Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize. At Riverside, he said, quote, "When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door that leads to ultimate reality." Memorials, like the one to King and the men and women of 9/11, speak not simply of our loss, but of unfinished business. And you find that, too, in the greatest memorial oration delivered on American soil. In the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln spoke of the responsibility that belonged to those who would survive the Civil War. "It is for us the living," he said. "It is for us the living. And to us the living, the task falls of rebuilding after great unanticipated violence." In the immediate weeks that followed September 11th, a terrible cloud rose into the crystalline sky above lower Manhattan. Boiling up from the burning ruins, it carried aloft the ashes of 3,000 people, daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, individuals of every race, color, ethnicity, people of every imaginable religious faith, and those who shunned any religious identity. Those honored dead, to borrow Lincoln's phrase, deserve their memorial, but not simply a physical one. They deserve our dedication that we fight terror's ultimate goal, the destruction of civil society. They deserve all the effort we can muster against fear and stereotyping and in support of education about one another. They deserve a clear-headed, unsentimental monument to hope in the hard, unfinished business of forging community. As Camus wrote in that pamphlet handed to me so long ago, what we must fight is fear and silence and the spiritual isolation they involve. What we must defend is dialogue and the universal communication of all people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much like I felt after reading his book, after hearing the lecture, I think it's something that needs to enter our curriculum here. A place where I'd like to think that some of the values he was talking about is upheld in our multi-traditional world of the Divinity School. So thank you very, very much, Gustav, for this inspiring talk tonight. We do have a few minutes, I think now 10 minutes for questions, and then we will retire down the hall where you can perhaps speak to our speaker individually during our reception. So. I'm sorry, not down the hall tonight. You're quite right. We're going upstairs to the library. I'll come back to remind you of that at the end. But let's have 10 minutes of questions, and I'll just let Gustav recognize and answer questions himself. Please.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Your experience among interfaith dialogue is a question regarding that. Well, I want to paraphrase. I'm an atheist. I've been coming to these talks here for 40 years, learning about religion. But recently, I'm originally from Pakistan, and I've been watching what's going on over there relative to 9/11 and what Al-Qaeda is doing in that area. Recently, there were several reports in the press that there are two, probably you are very well aware of, there are two sects in Islam, Shia and Muslims, the main ones. There's several times this month, the Sunni sect fundamentalists have killed and blown up mosques where the Shiites were praying or doing their things. And it really disturbs me as a Pakistani, even though I'm non-religious. And I grew up with Shia, though I was born in the Sunni sect, but I had several friends who were Shiite, and I understand their religiosity. I just want to ask you from the outsider, I know from the inside, is there any way that there can be some peace created between these two sects? It's very important.
Well, is this on here? All right. Can you hear me with this one? Oh, good. Yes. I think it's a very serious question you ask, but the answer is yes. And Sunnis and Shiites coexist peacefully in many parts of the world. They don't in some areas of Pakistan and in some other areas. I think that what you describe, and I read about those incidents, they're absolutely horrible. They're atrocious. They're offenses against humanity. And they command headlines. One of the things about violence, and I speak as either a former journalist or kind of a recovering journalist, you can't have that, never recover. But violence is much more easy to describe than peace. And it's because you can quantify violence. In this case, how many people were dead, how big the bomb was, the amount of damage done. You can quantify all of that. And you can get good sound bites out of the violent. With peace, it's very difficult because you're talking about things that don't happen. Actually, they do. People hold themselves together. It's rare that a peace movement, a genuine peace movement, is covered as exciting news, the exception being in Egypt earlier this year, which was extraordinary. And extraordinary for some technological reasons, too, because if anyone tuned into Al Jazeera English, which I was able to do on my laptop, it should be available, I think, everywhere in the United States, but it's not, unless you flip up your laptop. But you could flip up your laptop and watch people in Tahrir Square reacting to what they were seeing on Al Jazeera, which was broadcasting them. And that was remarkable. And that was a triumph in some ways of technology feeding into a desire for democracy. So your question is well taken. I think, though, that outside of the many areas where you have fanatics who are attempting to destroy society, such as in parts of Pakistan and in Afghanistan where there's hatred of Shiites as well, there's a great deal of peace that goes on, too, of people who are being constructive. Yes?
That brings in the question of the role of the press.
Mm-hmm.
And with these 24-hour cycles of constant breaking news, peace is not really news. And so is there any way we can change that? We can change the interest of those cycles of the common press. I'm really irritated. I read Al Jazeera as well on my laptop every morning because I'm interested in Libya, and it's the only place where you really can see that. One of the few places, or some of the other Muslim, Al Arabiya also. So the question is, why do we want all this violence in our press? Why don't we want the stories that you tell that are so endearing and pleasant to listen to?
All right. That'll be that. Thank you. There are two ways of looking at this. There's a sort of the crude old newspaper cliche: if it bleeds, it leads. But I don't quite accept that. The other way, somewhat optimistic, is to say if it's violence, it's the exception. And peace does get covered a lot. It may not be recognized for what it is. Even the writers themselves, or the broadcasters, may not. Right now, what's very interesting, peace, and I should say constructive activity. It's clear, the news media, news organizations, and I'm generalizing here in a way I try to avoid when I say the news media, because that means a whole host of different things. It means something different to everybody. It's like saying religion, you know, it just means something different. But right now, as we're speaking, news organizations are trying to figure out what is going on with Occupy Wall Street. They just don't know. And in some ways, it's humorous to listen to this. But I think some sort of social movement is underway in the United States, and it's trying to be nonviolent. And that is important. Its messages are not necessarily about nonviolence, but nonviolence is woven in there. But it can be hilarious and sort of saddening to hear something like this being radically misunderstood. And I'll give you an example. One of the most notable political commentators, whom I will not name, on National Public Radio, was asked about this on Monday. And the only way she could respond was in terms of whether it was good or bad for Barack Obama. I don't think it has anything to do with Barack Obama. Well, in some ways because he's president. But it's fascinating. Something is happening. Something is happening again. I see it among my students. They're curious about it. Occupy Wall Street's going on in Syracuse. When I called up a map on the web recently of the sites of Occupy Wall Street, there are more than 100 different little arrows pointing to places all over the country. And those are people who have created this sort of vast decentralized network. Why? It's something like the interreligious dialogue movement, except they haven't availed themselves as much of technology because they tend to be older. More's the pity. Other questions?
Hi, I very much enjoyed your talk and your book. And just towards the end, actually, you mentioned for, I think, the first time, people who shun religious identity, I believe is something you said.
Yes.
And I'm really curious about how you conceptualize atheists in this conversation. Do you see them as silent players or people you haven't focused on in the same conversation? Or do you think about atheists and religious folk having conversation in a different capacity from the interfaith work that you're talking about?
I think that atheists certainly have a place at the table. I think they come to this discussion late, but they're very serious people who want in. And I've met some of them here at Harvard. Atheists, agnostics, and they go under different names, you know. Some people call themselves free thinkers. But there are people who recognize that what's important is to try to find that common ethic at this time. And that common ethic doesn't have to be cast as a religious common ethic, which is, I think, a very important entry point in that case. I think, though, when I talk about the people who are interested, I have to sort of move aside the people who want to claim the word atheist for commercial purposes in a very prominent way. They're clever and they are entertaining as all get out, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. But they have very little to say. I mean, they are like people who have found the one sentence that answers everything, you know? And there are people in politics and in economics like that, and throughout history. They've found the one key that unlocks absolutely everything and will make the world perfect. It's a little dangerous. They're also, from my own experience in journalism, which is supposed to be just absolutely laden news organizations with atheists, that's the rumor. I never really wanted to sort of explore that, but a good many people would come up to me during my 16 years of writing about religion, and they would introduce themselves as not religious. They're my colleagues. And I'd sort of think, I didn't ask, and you know, I don't care, you know, I'm a journalist, you're a journalist. But that would be followed by something. There was a reason for that. And what was behind it was they were often wrestling with deep questions of meaning and questions of life that some people, not everyone, would express as being fundamental to religion, but it didn't fit any mold that they could possibly think of. And the whole idea of religion itself was something organized and something, if you will, soul-killing. It was what they had experienced either at 13 or their friends had experienced at 13. Was it really atheism? I don't know. But that didn't stop them from being very, you know, concerned about having discussions, wanting to find an outlet for discussions of meaning. Whether they would cast that in a secular framework continually, that was their choice. But there is, as I say, a place for them. I firmly believe that. It's just that those who are involved are coming late, but better late than never.
I regret having to cut this off. I hope the conversations will continue during the reception, but thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
I think this has been an extremely appropriate lecture this evening to celebrate a milestone in the history of Harvard Divinity School. We're very proud of our library and of its staff, and for 100 years this library has been the heart of this community, providing us as scholars with the resources and services that we need to do our work. And I think indeed an important aspect of the library's mission is to provide resources that increase interfaith understanding, or what we have heard in Gustav Niebuhr's lecture as the choice of words over bullets. Let me now invite all of us to celebrate further this happy occasion and this wonderful lecture by moving together up to the second floor of the Andover-Harvard Theological Library, where for once you may eat and drink inside the library. We're in the Stendhal lobby, where we're going to, as I say, continue our celebration. And I want to note that in addition to music and refreshments, there is already a wonderful exhibit in the lobby for you to see. This exhibit features sacred texts, some conventional and some and very much expected, and some really not so. I think you'll be really entertained and educated by this exhibit, as well as I hope entertained by conversation and more words. Thank you again so much.